Hi everyone. Today we are going to be discussing VABB, and this is in chapter 1 of your textbook. It's around page 27. And so today's lecture is VABB and the beginning of our journey. So what does VABB mean? VABB means to validate, affirm, build, and bridge. For us to be culturally and linguistically responsive to our students means that we need to validate and affirm indigenous or home culture, so where your students are coming from, and for the purpose of building and bridging the students to success in the culture of school and mainstream society. So let's get into this. So the 4 focus words of VABB are validation, which is to make legitimate that which the institution and mainstream has made illegitimate, and we're going to get into detail about that. Affirmation, to make positive that which the institution and mainstream media have made negative. So this is where we're going to affirm that our students' culture is actually a good thing, even if they do need to consider code switching in the real world. Building or making connections between the home culture and language with the school culture and language through instructional strategy and activity. And bridging or giving the opportunities for situational appropriateness or utilization of the appropriate culture and linguistic behavior. So when are you going to expect your students to be more like mainstream or use proper terminology, versus when they can use their home language in your classroom? And when I mean home language, I don't mean if they are ESL students. I mean, we all speak differently amongst our friends and family members than we normally do amongst our teachers and our classmates when we are in a more formalized educational environment. So let's talk about validation first. Validation is the intentional and purposeful legitimization of home culture and language of the student. My apologies for that typo, not laughter. It should be language. So this is where we need to validate that whatever home culture your student is bringing into the classroom, whatever that might be, that is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. Some cultures in U.S. mainstream culture could be considered rude, loud, unmotivated, or lazy. And we want to make sure that those students know that that's not how we feel about them. So here's a beautiful picture. It comes from a student-driven project where students want mainstream America to understand things that are said to them that they take offense to or that they want their teachers to know about them. So, for example, this young man says Muslims are not all terrorists. Well, yeah, no brainer. But can you imagine growing up in school around the time of 9/11? This woman is wearing glasses and she says, I can actually see you. This black woman says, my hair is real. This woman who's wearing a hijab says, I will marry whoever I want. Commonly, people think that some cultures, including Muslim culture, mandate that parents choose who you marry, and that's not necessarily the case. This gentleman says, I am not a color. This gentleman says, I will not cut your grass. So he likely has had things said to him indicating that his culture indicates that he likely would be like a day laborer or someone who works in landscaping. This Hispanic woman says, we're not all Mexican. I think this is a very important picture, particularly in our region, because we have a ton of students from Central and Southern America, and they are not all Mexican, and that's very important for us to understand. This one says, not all Asians are studious, have squinty eyes, and speak the same language. So this gentleman who identifies as Asian is indicating that they don't all look the same. And this woman says, I am not white trash. So these are things that students have experienced and want teachers and others in society to understand about them. And so we as educators need to validate that whatever they're coming from is legitimate, and that we are not going to apply biases and stereotypes to our students. We also need to affirm. So I'm going to move myself real quick. So affirmation, the intentional and purposeful effort to reverse negative stereotypes, images, and representation of a marginalized culture and language promoted by the media. How many of us, when we were in preschool and elementary school, made pilgrim hats and Indian hats as in Native American hats, where the Native American hats were like the construction band with the feathers in the back? I mean, come on, folks. That is not a good representation of our Native American people. Consider this picture of like a 1950s advertisement for ketchup where it says, "You mean a woman can open it?" Like she doesn't need her man to open a bottle of ketchup. Let's just switch that out with a man. And like, how weird is this picture to you? So I think we need to look at things we need to affirm that negative stereotypes against people of color, people of disability, and sex they're not in your classroom. You want to make sure that you show in the environment around your classroom. So if you're putting up posters and pictures in your classroom, that you have a wide range of representation of individuals between men and women, but also of race and ability. I mean, how many of our elementary, middle, and high school students get to see wheelchair athletes or people of color who are wearing lab coats, or astronauts, or famous minority mathematicians, or famous authors who aren't white and cis? So consider that. Also, when your students are speaking and they say something that involves a negative stereotype, that is your time to create a learning opportunity. Do not ignore it, but also it's a time, because your students might not even understand what they're doing, for you to point out how their language can affect others in your classroom. And consider the language that you speak as well. Are you affirming negative stereotypes in your lessons, and in the YouTube videos you choose, and the worksheets you choose, and the materials that you choose in your own lesson plans? Then we have building. Building is understanding and recognizing cultural and linguistic behaviors of students and using those behaviors to foster rapport and relationship. This is such a beautiful moment that you can have with your students. If your students are using cultural references from their home life, if that's Cajun culture, if that's from the country of origin that they're from, if it's from another region of the United States that they're coming from, or even a different region of Louisiana, what a wonderful opportunity for you to learn from your students. I love building. In this class alone, whenever I have folks who come from a strong Cajun culture background, I want to know more. I want them to explain certain terms that they've used in the classroom that I may not understand. I like to understand how people celebrate their holidays that come from different cultures, just because what a beautiful thing to learn about your students, but also a beautiful way to build relationships. I can teach students a little bit about my culture and how we celebrate things. And so it gives them more of a worldly view about how other people may speak or talk about their home life and their culture. So instead of us constantly berating students for the language and the culture that they're bringing into the school, we should celebrate it and understand where it comes from. But, and this is where the bridging comes from, we also need to provide the academic and social skills that students need to be successful beyond the classroom. If you have students who are using a lot of slang and a lot of culturally specific language in the way that they express themselves, both in writing and in speaking, this is a time for us to teach students when it's appropriate to code switch. So what does code switching mean? It means that we might speak one way at home or in our neighborhoods or in our places of worship, but those may not be socially acceptable in the workplace, in a college classroom, or let's say like in a courtroom, right? And so this is the time for us to start thinking about, how can I make my students successful in the quote unquote real world? What terms and what things that we are doing at home may not necessarily be culturally acceptable in other places in the United States. So, prime example, a lot of my students use the term ain't, which is fine because that's the term that they use at home. However, if they start using ain't in their writing or when they are responding during a Socratic session in my classroom, I will say, hey, I understand what you're saying, but instead of using the term ain't, since that is not going to be acceptable in a courtroom or in a high school classroom, maybe we should consider another term instead. Or I might send back a paper or a discussion board and say, I understand what you're saying here, but if you were writing this as a report to your superintendent or your department chair, you might want to consider using a different term from ain't. And could you please revise this for me and send it back for full credit? So I'm not berating anybody for the term that they're using because it's something that they're comfortable with. But instead, I'm trying to use this as a teaching moment to show my students when it's appropriate to use this term and when we may want to avoid using that term altogether. And that's something that is going to be a wonderful opportunity for you all as high school, middle school, and elementary school teachers. Additionally, we don't want to make something unacceptable in the sense that if this is how someone is able to express themselves, we should give them that opportunity to express themselves, right? So if a student, particularly we're talking about middle school and elementary school students who are still learning how to manage their emotions and express themselves properly being not screaming and yelling and hitting. So that's an opportunity for you to allow that student to use what's culturally relevant for them to express themselves and then say, okay, I get what you're saying. I understand why you're angry. I understand why you're upset. Now let's talk about how we can express ourselves in a different way so that somebody who isn't a close friend of yours, or if you were in someone else's classroom who doesn't know you as well, can understand what's going on. So you're providing them the skills to be successful outside your classroom. So what could prevent you from vabbing? Now this is where you're going to see how Hollander scaffolds her lessons. We all have hidden biases, and next week we are going to find out what those hidden biases are. However, everything that we've been doing about identifying our own cultures and the cultures of others, that all plays in to vabbing or validating, affirming, building, and bridging. So do you have a deficit monitor? What does that mean, Hollander? That means, do you have an internal monitor that you are looking at students solely as negative? Now, I always tell you all this. You all are angels in my eyes, and on Friday and Saturday nights, you're all studying, and we're not going out, and we're not participating in any behaviors that I wouldn't agree with. But the reality is, that may not necessarily be the truth. And over time, you might get really worn down and burnt out and start thinking, if we had better students, then we would have better schools. Or our scores were good before they started coming here. Or everyone in our school seems to be doing well except for those kids. What's wrong with them? When you start seeing an us versus them with a subset of your students, you need to check yourself. Now, it does naturally happen. We are all human and we get frustrated. You might have a particular group of students with behavioral issues that are driving you bonkers in your class. And so you might find yourself having this internal conversation. And you might also encounter faculty at your schools who have this conversation outwardly. And I would recommend that you avoid these people as much as possible. Do not let them bring you down. So check out this cartoon, and I'm going to show it to you again on the next slide, so hold tight in even bigger form. So Sometimes we need to check ourselves. Let me move myself again because I like to put stuff all over my slides. Sometimes we need to check ourselves. So here is a cartoon of a woman, and she's wearing a bikini and she's walking around in public in her bikini, and she's thinking everything is covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture. Now she is having this internal dialogue with herself based on her own culture and understanding of the other woman's culture. Now this woman who is completely covered up, she's wearing a burqa, says nothing covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture. Now she is making that judgment based on her own culture. And I think it's really important for us to kind of look at both sides of things, right? We talk about this a lot when we are picking text in our English classes, when we're presenting historical periods, that we always want to show both sides of whatever's happening in that piece. So what we need to do is we need to check ourselves. So you need to check your filter. Where did the information about the other woman come from? Did this woman find this out from mainstream TV? Is she actually a scholar of Islam or Middle Eastern culture? Like where is she getting this idea from? And then this woman over here, where is she getting her information from? Is she getting it from mainstream TV? Is she getting it from culture? Is she a scholar of European and American culture? We're not sure, but we need to understand where we are getting our information. And then we need to question the belief system. What did these women believe about society? So what do they believe about society and patriarchy and fashion, right? Like where are they getting their beliefs from? And we need to think about that from ourselves too. Where did we get our beliefs from? Hence why we had to identify our cultures. And then we need to listen to our deficit monitor. We need to look at the situation from each other's points of view. So if these two women had actually interacted with each other and had asked each other this question, they might have learned something from each other and about each other's culture and their perspective on society. So you've seen this before, the culture iceberg. Knowing your culture and VABB. Remember that part of VABB is making a positive and legitimate association with cultures, particularly cultures that are not your own. So what part of your culture has a negative connotation? Think about it. If you are Cajun, how does mainstream media depict you? If you are Hispanic, if you are white Catholic, if you are white Southern, if you are Black Southern, if you are Black Christian, if you are coming from high socioeconomic status or low socioeconomic status, what type of positive and negative connotations come with those cultural identifications? And how does mainstream media depict your ethnocultural background? If you were to leave Southeastern Louisiana tomorrow, and we dropped you in a big city like Chicago, New York, San Francisco, and you said, "Hi, I am from Southeastern Louisiana," what do you think people are going to immediately think of you as? And is that fair? And I'd like you to consider that when those students walk through your classroom in the first day of school and start expressing themselves with their home culture or their indigenous culture and language. And it's not fair for us to put negative connotations on that culture. So if you are watching this, it means that you are watching this online. I really want you to watch this video, which we're going to watch in class. And it's about a teacher who validates her international student body and how she does it. And she does it in a beautiful way that doesn't add any extra to her workload. So please check out this video. I'm not going to make you watch it on the screen recording, but you have it on Moodle. And finally, if you were in class, we discussed, based on the subject grade you want to teach, how will you apply VABB to your classroom? And if you teach math and science, that does not mean that we cannot validate, affirm, build, and bridge with our students. You just might get a little more creative on how you might have your students do that. And so we're going to break up into groups, one person from each subject, and create a list of 3 things you would do in your classroom that support VABB. I hope you all enjoy this 20-minute lecture, and I cannot wait to see you again real soon. Take care.